Hello and welcome to another wonderful episode of the Living Hellenismos podcast, starring Tony Mierzwicki. We have a wonderful show today. Tony is so very excited to welcome fellow author Patrick Dunn. I would first like to introduce the host of our show, the star of our show, Tony, and give a little shout out to his books. If you don't know them, they're absolutely fabulous. We have Greco-Egyptian magic and also Hellenismos, so fabulous books. And I would like to go ahead at this point and add Tony to the chat. How are you, Tony? Welcome to the show, to your show.
Doing really well, Susan. Thank you so much for your very kind introduction.
My pleasure. I will let you take it away. Have a great interview.
Okay, will do. We're very pleased to have Patrick Dunn to talk about two books that he wrote titled The Practical Art of Divine Magic, Contemporary and Ancient Techniques of Theurgy, and The Orphic Hymns, a new translation for the occult practitioner. I reviewed these books for my Patheos blog, Holistic Spirituality, in September 2023 and March 2019, respectively, and wanted to learn a little bit more about them. And that early date, March 2029, shows you just how long I've wanted to have Patrick on the show. So I'm really excited to finally have him on. But first, let's have a look at Patrick's background. Patrick Dunn is a poet, linguist, pagan, and a university English professor with a PhD in modern literature and language. His understanding of semiotics and the study of symbols arise from his training in linguistics and literary theory. He has practiced magic since childhood. Patrick, thanks for making yourself available and coming on the show. How are you today?
I'm good. Thank you very much for having me.
Pleasure. And as I said before, I've been wanting to have you on the show for 4 years now, so I'm really pleased. And thank you so much for making yourself available, like I said. So we might just start with your translation of the Orphic hymns. You wrote that most of the hymns have a clearly defined practical purpose, and you provide a handy list of these purposes and the appropriate hymn or hymns to be used. I consider this to be a fascinating way of using the Orphic hymns, as I normally use them to call on a deity for a task or for devotional use, and I haven't focused too much on the purposes already in the hymns themselves. How did you come about using them in that way?
Well, I've always been interested in the idea of incantation from a literary perspective. And I have another book, Magic, Language, Power, Symbol, where I kind of delve into that. And I talk in that book about the Atharva Veda, one of the texts of the Hindu religion, which is essentially what we might call a collection of verse spells. And I noticed sort of a parallel, I'm not saying there was influence, although there may have been, but sort of a parallel structure to that and some of the Orphic hymns. And so there will be, a request for good weather at the end of some of the Orphic hymns, particularly in reference to weather gods. So as I was translating, I started to see that as a pattern and think, well, maybe these had a use, liturgical, but also magico-religious, the mixture of the two.
Links have been documented between the Greeks and the Indians in late antiquity, and that was as a result of Alexander the Great extending his empire all the way to India. So quite possibly there was a bit of cross-fertilization there. I'm just thinking out aloud.
No, I think you're 100% correct that there could have been. And we know that Ashoka, for example, sent Buddhist missionaries to the Hellenistic Empire to preach. And there's some speculation that the skeptic school and maybe the cynic school were influenced by Buddhist missionaries or Buddhist ideas. And I find that fascinating. I find that I'm tempted to want to write a book about it. I'm not sure I'm going to, but
I actually hope that you do write it. It's a fascinating field of inquiry. And for me, the best thing about the Hellenistic world was that you had this cross-cultural mixing from the length and breadth of Alexander's empire. So to actually explore that further would have to be a very worthwhile enterprise.
Yeah, and that's a drum I often beat, that we think of Greek as the peninsula that currently bears that name, but the culture, the Hellenic culture, stretches for thousands of years from India to England. You know, that expanse of space and time. It's a little mind-boggling how long and pervasive those cultural influences spread.
Hmm. How magically effective do you consider the Orphic hymns to be in comparison with other hymns, such as, for instance, the Homeric hymns?
That's a great question. One of the issues with using the Homeric hymns in magic, or even for devotion, is one, they weren't written for that purpose. They were written to win poetry writing contests, and so they're beautiful. And you know, Athanasakis in his introduction to his first edition translation of the Orphic hymns compares them to the Homeric hymns and says something along the lines of the Homeric hymns are just superior poetry, and he's 100% correct. They're better poetry. But they weren't written for magic. Whereas the Orphic hymns were written as a liturgy for a religious, I'll use the word cult, but by cult, I mean initiatory group, not necessarily what we mean by cult, the Orphic cult. So, you know, whether they regard them as being magical in the sense that we might, I don't know, I doubt it. They probably saw them as devotional, but certainly with a magical use, like certainly with what we might call a magical use. As far as, you know, how effective they are, I suppose it's not good marketing to say any hymn that you feel connected to in that way is going to be more effective than something you don't for magic, for the most part, with maybe a couple exceptions. So I think, you know, something that you write yourself could be just as effective as one of the Homeric hymns. One of the magical benefits of using, or I'm sorry, one of the Orphic hymns, but one of the benefits of using something traditional like the Orphic hymns, or even the hymns of, you know, Proclus, is you're tapping into sort of a historical current and context that can connect you to, I don't want to get all woo, but, you know, ancestral forces, ideas that are minds that are prior to ours. And I think that can be very beneficial in magic. There's something to be said for having a tradition to work within. So long answer, I suppose, to that question.
You know, I'm a little bit biased. I always find myself seeing magic just about everywhere. But the thing is that the hymns weren't just poetry, because we're dealing with a society that incorporated the veneration of the deities into everyday life. It was so seamlessly integrated into society that they didn't even have a word for religion. So you had people who were working devotionally with the gods, and you know, and the line between devotion and magic is very fine indeed. So I tend to perceive them as being somewhat magical, but hey, that is my personal bias, and I'm fully guilty.
Well, I see them as more magical than the Homeric hymns. The Homeric hymns are wonderful, but they weren't even necessarily written for an overtly devotional purpose. You know, many of them were written just to win a contest, which there's nothing wrong with that. And those contests, of course, were, like you pointed out, that those contests were actually devotional acts as well. So, you know, they were in honor of various gods. So the line does get fuzzy, certainly.
Hmm. I've come across practitioners who will recite the Orphic hymns in Greek rather than use an English translation such as yours. Do you think that reciting the hymns in their original language makes them more powerful or more effective? And if so, is there a degree of magical power in the Greek language which is lacking in English?
To your second question, no. I don't think, I think all languages have magic in them. They all
Okay.
have a power, and all languages are essentially equal. an expressive power and a magical power. It's just you can express different things in different languages more easily. When it comes to Greek, and reciting the hymns in Greek, if you can do that with a mind of with a mind of understanding what you're saying, then I think that's great. I think it's probably less powerful to have to sound out the Greek very carefully and not know what it means. So, some of the hymns I'll recite in Greek when I'm doing my devotions, especially if they're ones that I do a lot and know very well. But some of them I would rather just use the English. So, it really does depend a bit. The only thing I think where you might say that the original language matters a lot is in things like the Greek magical papyri, where you have barbarous words, which we can't even necessarily translate. Then I think it's worthwhile to try to pronounce them in the original. The problem, the issue with that is, what's the original? If you try to pronounce them as they were pronounced in Koine Greek, that's different than if you try to pronounce them as you would reconstructed Athenian Golden Age Greek. Those are two very different languages. And of course, modern Greek is a completely different language. So with continuity, but they're going to sound very different.
I mean, my intuition is to work with them in Koine Greek, because that was the Greek that was spoken at the time that they were written. They were first written from the 2nd century BCE to the 5th century CE. And with the barbarous words, or the words of power, some of them were just vowel chants. Some of them were words that can't be translated. Some of them were either names of deities or corruption of names of deities. So, for instance, if we hadn't translated cuneiform, we wouldn't know what Ereshkigal was. We wouldn't know what Shamash was.
Yeah.
So,
and some of them are just Coptic, transcribed into Greek letters, late Coptic. So like the one that occurs a lot, of course, is pre, which is just pa re, right? The sun in Coptic. My Coptic is not great, so it's probably pa re, I would guess. But in Greek that would be translated pre. So yeah, they probably meant something. So I think there it's probably a good idea to try to pronounce them. And I agree with you. I generally, the pronunciation I tend to use is a mixture of Koine and classical that would be totally baffling to any actual ancient person, because I'm not hung up on the accuracy of pronunciation, which gets me in trouble sometimes with people who really invest a lot of their identity in correctness, which is fine. But I have heard them pronounced and sung in reconstructed Golden Age Greek, which is beautiful. One of the issues you run into is, I agree with your intuition to pronounce them as if they were written in Koine, but the problem is they're not actually written in Koine. That Koine was the language that the people who wrote them no doubt spoke, but they're written in the Epic dialect, which is a dialect that probably is partially artificial anyway. And so it's a person whose daily language is Koine imitating an Epic dialect. It would be as if I tried to write a poem in Old English, right, or in Middle English. Like I tried to imitate Chaucer, and you run into weird little grammatical things sometimes when you look at the Greek of them because of that. It's like, did they actually understand that particle they're using? And I could nerd out about that because there's a whole bunch of really cool stuff.
well, it was the same deal with the Chaldean oracles. They were written at a time when Koine Greek was being used. However, they were written using Golden Age Greek, as you call it, or Archaic Greek.
Yeah. Well, I call Golden Age Greek, the classical Greek of Athens around the time of Plato or Socrates.
4th and 5th century, yeah.
And then the Epic Greek was old even by then. Epic Greek is the dialect in which Homer is written, the Homeric hymns are written, and then that's imitated right up through the Koine period. Probably there are modern Greek poets who imitate bits of it. I don't know my modern Greek poetry so well, but I imagine there probably are people who dabble with it. So there's and you run into the issue of the perennial issue of vowel pronunciations in Greek. So like if you're gonna take the Greek magical papyri and pronounce those vowel chants in Koine Greek, they're gonna sound like E, right? Because so many of the vowels collapsed into E at some point before the Demotic period. So my guess is whoever wrote them was thinking epic dialect, where those vowel sounds all have distinct sounds, rather than, because if you have an eta and an iota and an upsilon together, those are all pronounced E in late Greek, whereas in epic Greek they're A, E, E. So very distinct sounds.
Okay, so I wanted to segue into your book on theurgy. How effective do you consider the Orphic hymns to be for the practice of theurgy?
That's actually why I translated the Orphic hymns.
Ah,
I wrote that book on theurgy, and I was using the Orphic hymns in my own practice because they're just wonderfully handy. As you know, it's like just an encyclopedia of pre-made prayers. It's great.
yes.
And I was using them in my own practice. I was using the original Greek a little bit, but I wanted a translation that I could use because I sometimes like I said, I sometimes like to use them in English. And I looked at the available translation. Of course, there's Taylor's, which is just very, very old and very, he replaces the Greek names with Roman names, which was common practice at the time, which just feels weird to me. They rhyme, which irks me. Because the originals certainly don't rhyme. That wasn't a thing. So then I read Athanasakis' translation, which I thought was better, but kind of lacked the poetry. And I think sometimes, and I'm not casting shade at Athanasakis by any means, but sometimes I think he swung at the wrong pitch. Like I don't think he really got that they were a liturgy, that they were of a religious purpose. I mean, I think he knew that intellectually, but I don't think he got it, And so I thought, and like I said, not throwing shade. He's a great translator. But I thought, well, I want something that I can use myself. And so I started just doing some of the translations myself for my own use. And then I contacted my editor after I got about 20 of them and said, do you think this would be a good book, or do you think this would be a waste of my time? And she was very excited about it. So I put it together. Which turned out to be a much larger undertaking than I thought it would be. So to answer your question, I think they're really useful. I think there's other hymns that are also useful. I really like some of the hymns of Proclus, especially his hymn to Janus and Hecate. So Janus, the Roman god of doorways, of course, and Hecate, the goddess of crossroads and a cosmic goddess that unites all three worlds and a whole bunch of other stuff. And he writes a single hymn that sort of syncretizes them in a really interesting way. So I use that as well in my work sometimes.
Do you use Julian's hymns as well?
Bits of them I have. I really like. I mean, I've read a lot of Julian, but mostly for the philosophy. I was really interested in sort of that late Neoplatonic attempt to construct a system around things. And I think one of the texts I come back to again and again was Solstices on the World and the Gods, which Julian references. I really like some of those ideas, particularly from a theurgic perspective, where you're not just trying to get your crops to grow, you're trying to understand the fundamental ground of being and connect with the nature of reality itself, which is a loftier aim, I think. Not that the crop growing is not also important now that I think of it, but
It's very important.
Got to understand the fundamental ground of being. You do have to eat. So yeah, I guess. Yeah.
One bit that you said a couple of minutes ago that really jumped out at me was the way you looked at the Orphic hymns as a collection of prayers, and that's basically how I use them. You've got prayers to most of the gods that you're ever going to work with, and they're all there in a handy format. And that's why I found myself absolutely intrigued by you going through the hymns and finding what purpose the hymns had. Because I would look at the purpose I wanted to address, work out what God was the most appropriate, then go through the Orphic hymns and find that particular God and work with that God. Whereas you've kind of turned that idea on its head. So something I definitely want to start exploring.
That was something I really wanted this book to do too, is I had already started putting together sort of an apparatus for myself, just on little scraps of paper, like little cross references. And so when I was working on the book and talking about it with my editor, I was like, I think it would be cool to have like a good apparatus at the end, like a good index, a good glossary, and a good cross-referencing of the sorts of things that are mentioned in the hymns. And I think that makes it really useful.
It does make it really useful because it's not just another translation. You've actually got another way of using the hymns. You've got particular rituals that you've incorporated into the book. So you're contributing something fresh and exciting to the field rather than just producing another rehash.
Well, thank you very much. That's what I tried to do. And it was an undertaking, but it was very satisfying.
It's an amazing text. So kudos to you for writing it. It's a book that a lot of us have gotten a lot of value out of.
Well, good. I'm very glad to hear that. That makes it worth the effort.
So people in this day and age tend to be very familiar with the term theurgy. However, you place a lot of emphasis on achieving kenosis, which can be defined as unity with the one or the source. And you state that there are resemblances as well as differences with nirvana in Buddhism and moksha in Hinduism. Could you expand on that? Give us a little bit more background on it.
How much time do you have?
Well, we've got an hour total, so.
Okay, good. Yeah, it's an extremely complicated topic. And, my qualifications to speak about Buddhist and Hindu theology are thin. And I admit that, right? I'm not an expert in those areas. I've read extensively on them, but as a layperson. My understanding of nirvana is that it comes from a Sanskrit root meaning to extinguish or blow out, like a candle. And the idea being that you extinguish the sense of self that is illusory, the sense of, it's illusory because a person in Buddhism is not one thing, but a process of things. A person is a person the way a tornado is a thing, right? It's a movement of things. That's what a person is. And so when that dissipates, the sense of self dissipates. I don't think that's quite the same thing as kenosis, because I think it's so hard to talk about kenosis, right? Because what you're talking about is a unity of all disparate things that seem disparate. The moment you start to do that, you have to use language, and language works by difference. So to talk about kenosis, I have to use a tool that automatically just has to destroy kenosis to get there. And that's why so much of it is paradoxical, or, like the little, like the pranks of Diogenes, right? That just are meant to make you go, wait, no, what? So it's a difficult thing to talk about. Nirvana is kind of the same way. It's kind of hard to talk about something about selflessness when you're using the self to talk about it. One of the differences, I think, with kenosis, at least from my understanding of it, is the ancient Greek philosophers really thought more about this sort of development less as a single attainment and more as a process. So, they saw it as kind of like you go to the gym and you work out every day and you get stronger and stronger at these things. Aristotle actually, I think, makes that an explicit metaphor for developing virtue. You work out your virtue and you get stronger in virtue. So there's, especially in like Zen Buddhism, there's this idea of like sudden enlightenment that changes everything. And I don't think kenosis is like that. I think you can have an experience of kenosis. You can have an awareness of yourself as participating in the oneness of the world, of the cosmos, and then come back and pay your bills and stub your toe and swear at the furniture. But once you have that experience, and especially as you have that experience more and more, you begin to stub your toe and swear at the furniture, realizing you're the furniture and you're the pain in your toe and you're the swearing, and you're kind of just playing out the roles at that point. As for how that's different from nirvana, in practice, I'm not sure how much different it is. In philosophy, I think there's a difference there, because nirvana is more about recognizing the underlying emptiness of phenomena, whereas henosis is recognizing the underlying oneness of phenomena. So, like I said, I could go on for ages, but I think all I would do is confuse the issue.
You know, while you were talking, I found myself relating to it in Kabbalistic terms. And it seems like kenosis corresponds to the experience of Kether, you know, just shy of the Ein Sof Or, whereas nirvana, the way you described it, is more like crossing the abyss and attaining to Bina, or the city of pyramids, as Crowley called it.
Yeah. Well, you know, there was probably significant Neoplatonic influence on early Kabbalistic writers, certainly. And they define, if I recall correctly, that experience of, you know, in the Golden Dawn, they had the Ein Sof, and the Ein Sof Or, which is lovely in its symmetry, but that's not traditional Kabbalah, as I understand it. It's Ein Sof is what the limitlessness of God beyond oneness, which I think is very much like the idea of Hoen, right? The one. As far as nirvana, crossing the abyss, yeah, maybe. I don't know. I'm always leery about making those parallels. I know I have a thing in the book where I have a little chart making parallels, but I'm always leery about making those parallels, because we are dealing with extremely different you know, cultural assumptions and practices. And yeah, but maybe, yeah.
I mean, the reason why I tied it in with crossing the abyss was that that experience corresponds to the death of the ego, the dark night of the soul, which kind of ties in with the explanation of nirvana that you gave.
Yeah.
Like I said, these were just thoughts that I was having while you were talking.
Yeah. I mean, it's tempting to take, like, you know, the five sephira underneath the abyss and correspond them with the five skandhas, right? If I were 16 and still deeply into into that kind of magic, I would be making a chart right now. But
in your book, you wrote that over time, henosis will solve problems. And you wrote that sometimes those solutions will be miraculous, and sometimes you'll just see your problems from a perspective that makes them irrelevant. You added that henosis will make you a better person, more competent at life, and probably happier. Can you give examples of what readers can expect by following in your footsteps?
yeah, I don't want to oversell it, right? I don't want to say that henosis is a panacea that solves everything, because I don't think it does. I don't think anyone who says that any spiritual or psychological practice, for that matter, solves your problems completely is selling you something. And it's probably made from snake oil. I think the way that henosis, or really kind of any regular spiritual practice, solves your problems is you begin to get a wider perspective on them and see them in the context of your practice. So, you know, if you're practicing your meditation daily, which when I'm practicing my meditation daily, I'm doing better than when I'm not, but you know, I'm human. It's easy to get distracted. But when you practice your meditations daily, you're giving your offerings, you're doing your devotions, little things become, well, they reveal themselves as little things. I think, you know, some of the things that I have grown in as I began practicing theurgy, which, you know, I kind of started, like I alluded to, when I was 16, right? And started first really getting into, back then there were very few books on these things. So it was Kabbalah all the way. But what I've developed, I'm a kinder person than I was. I'm more patient. I care more about other people, which maybe that's just what happens as you age. But then again, I know a lot of people older than I am who are total jerks, so maybe not. You know, in terms of like my expectations of others. I'm a little more forgiving of their foibles. I'm a little more forgiving of my own foibles. Goodness knows I have many. And I think that that's something that comes out of having that experience of kenosis, and not just having it once, but like having it, coming back to the one helps you remember we are literally in this together. Like we are together. There's not a difference ultimately. We all partake in oneness. So that an exercise I really like for that is the exercise, the meditation on beauty, Diotima in the Symposium. She describes this meditation. Well, Socrates describes her describing this meditation to him. Interestingly, one of the only women philosophers whose name we know, Diotima, and also interestingly, one of the only two places where Socrates says that he's in a state of aporia, a state of being utterly baffled by a philosopher who is smarter than him. But she says that she describes this meditation where you take a beautiful object or person and contemplate their beauty, and then begin to abstract that beauty, abstract it to a virtue, abstract it to a law, or a social beauty, and then abstract it up even further into the beauty of the one, and then that beauty becomes the avenue to the one, which Plotinus also writes about, right, in his dialogue, his tractate on beauty. So that just once you begin to see beauty in these things, even things that previously seemed ugly or not something you liked, then you begin to develop a little more compassion for those things.
Interesting. There was an esoteric group that I came across, and they're followers of Uspensky and Gurdjieff, and their path towards spiritual advancement involved an appreciation of beauty, from what I was told. So they would be going off to the opera, to the theater, to art galleries to admire art. So that ties in perfectly with what you were just saying.
Yeah, and then for Diotima, the idea is you go from the beautiful thing to the beautiful idea, and then from the beautiful idea to the idea of beauty, and then from the idea of beauty to the idea of the oneness, because beauty and oneness are the same thing, sort of. You run into a weird thing with Greek grammar there, because the hoen is described as tokalos, the good. Yeah, tokalos, the neuter. Tokalos, the good. But that actually also means the beautiful. And so good, beauty, and oneness are all linked together in just the grammar of talking about those things in Greek.
I was just thinking about what you said that Socrates had to say about Diotima, that he was actually baffled by her. The ancient Greek society was a society where women were treated like second-class citizens. It was only the priestesses who had any sort of standing, which is a little surprising when you consider how important Greek goddesses were. But the standing of the average woman was tended to be very low. So for Socrates to actually hold Diotima up in such respect shows just how progressive a thinker he was.
And he does it, Plato describes him doing it at a symposium, and symposia, women were explicitly forbidden from being there. It was to be men only. And so in a way, he invites this woman in, through his description of her, into this place where she's not supposed to be. Because he's Socrates, he's always doing stuff like that. But
yeah.
Well, that's
corrupting the youth.
Right. That's what I say when I go to teach freshman composition. I say I'm off to corrupt the youth.
That is so cool.
Construct a paragraph or whatever.
I noticed that in both your book on the Orphic hymns and the one on divine magic, which is the book on theurgy, you incorporated contemporary non-Greek practices. Is this because you found Greek modalities less effective, or do you feel that too little is known about them in order to use them effectively?
That's a great question. I think I don't find them less effective by any means. I think I did it for two reasons. One, as you said, there are gaps in our knowledge. You know, Iamblichus talks about using ritual in theurgy, but we have precious few rituals actually described by Iamblichus, right? And Plotinus talks about meditations, but we have only a couple meditations ever described. So you've got and you mentioned the Chaldean oracles earlier. Talk about gaps, right? All we have are fragmentary sentences that were quoted by other writers. And so if you try to construct anything coherent as in terms of philosophy or practice from something like the Chaldean oracles, which were apparently regarded with a lot of awe and importance, but it labor around the strophalos of Hecate. Okay, sure, whatever that means, right? Strophalos, the spinning thing. So I incorporate some sort of non-Hellenic practices. One, because it helps to fill in some of the gaps, and two, because Hellenic practices were wider and broader and more varied than we tend to think they were. And you see that actually in the Orphic hymns. There are hymns to goddesses that were worshipped in Anatolia and probably nowhere else. There are hymns to goddesses that we don't even see referenced anywhere else. There's the hymn to Melinoe. We have references to Melinoe. I believe she's referenced in a couple curse tablets as either a goddess of nightmares, a goddess of ghosts, or a epithet of Persephone. And it's not clear which of those she is. The Orphic hymns alludes to an entire myth connected with her. We have no idea what that myth is about. And unfortunately, the grammar of it is so ambiguous, we can't even construct who is doing what in that myth, much to my annoyance. So, you know, if you're going to build a system out of it, you have to figure out how to jump those gaps. And one way to do that is with some contemporary practices. The other reason I included it is just I want this to have a broader appeal. I'm not a Reconstructionist. I don't think the Reconstructionist project is one that can, I'm going to get in trouble for saying this. I don't think it's one that can work. To actually reconstruct ancient Greek religious practices completely, you would need to live in ancient Greece. You would need to have a polis that is actually devoted to these practices. And, you know, it's hard pressed enough to find a Facebook group that can agree. So I don't think that's a project that can actually succeed, strict Reconstructionism. So at some point you have to construct rather than reconstruct. And that's kind of where I draw from those more contemporary practices. I do point out when they're contemporary practices, or I try to make a firm distinction between this is what we know from the historical record and this is what we know from modern practices, and this is what I am pulling out of my ear, you know.
That's actually one of the things that I really like about your writing, that you identify what's taken from sources, and then you identify those sources so interested readers can then go to those sources, see how you've tweaked them, and either use what you have or tweak it still further or go back to the original. It's basically up to them. And the other thing that I really liked was that you pushed people away from animal sacrifice.
Yeah,
I'm vegetarian, so whenever I use the PGM, I always use bloodless sacrifices. It's just something I've always done.
and I'm not against animal sacrifice as an idea. There are some religions that even today use it, and I'm okay with that. The reason I push people away from it is vanishingly few people reading these books is trained as a butcher who can actually do an animal sacrifice properly. And doing it wrong is much worse than just not doing it at all. So like I think I say it in one of my books. I say, you know, if you are a farmer who raises your own beef and you actually have an abattoir where you butcher cattle and you know how to do it, I'll give that my stamp of approval, I suppose. But if you're just someone who said this book says I have to kill a dove for this spell, so no, you don't know how to do that right. Don't do it. You're just going to mess it up and you're going to make things much worse for yourself. So yeah, I prefer the bloodless approach, certainly, because I certainly am not qualified to kill an animal. I get a little squeamish when I cut up chicken for dinner, frankly. So I'm not a vegetarian, but yeah.
I had a Kabbalah teacher back home in Sydney, and he told me that with halal butchers, they are instructed to look the animal in the eyes as they slit its throat, so that they're very aware of taking the animal's life. So it's not just a matter of bleeding the animal to death. There is an actual protocol that goes with it. And I'm sure that they had something like that in ancient times as well.
They certainly did. The animal was to be decorated, brought to the altar. The priest is then sprinkles the head of the animal with water. Cattle mostly is what this is a reference to. So you sprinkle the head of the cow with water. The cow is supposed to nod their head as if in assent. They're doing to shake the water off, but still, if they don't do that, you don't do the sacrifice. And then they are to be killed with a single blow to the throat. The knife is hidden from the animal until the moment of death. And then when the animal dies, all the women at the festival are supposed to raise a yulule, a cry of mourning for the animal's death. So they were very aware of what they were doing, and in some ways, you know, more aware than modern middle class Americans, Europeans, you know, Australians who just go to the grocery store and buy their meat, right?
Exactly.
So, you know, I grew up on a farm. I have seen chickens slaughtered, and so I go to the store and buy my chicken. I know where it has been, but not everyone has that experience. Which I think if you're going to eat meat, you probably should know where your meat comes from.
Yeah, Burkett goes into great detail on the protocol followed in the actual live animal sacrifices. I have to say I was very impressed by a paragraph that you wrote where you encourage readers to experiment and find out what works for them rather than following authority figures. So this is what you wrote. I am no authority. The only authority is your own experience with the gods, not your wishes and fantasies, but your genuine experiences. I hope that by engaging with the exercises in this book, you will have enough experience with the divine that you can edit and modify and add to these practices as needed in order to continue your theurgy. Always throughout this book, my watchword is practicality. How can this be used now, today, by us? I love the way that you're telling people to not just slavishly follow what you're doing, but to work with it, master it, then tweak it and adapt it to your own needs. I mean, that is the way every magical text should be used, but hardly anyone ever spells that out. So I really like that bit.
Thank you. Good. I think I learned, you know, like I said, 16 years old, getting into magic, you run into two kinds of people in the occult community, especially in a small town. And some of them think that they know everything, and some of them encourage you to experiment. And I always gravitated to the ones who would say, I don't know everything. I don't have all the answers. In fact, you know, the more you study the esoteric, the more you study ancient Greek religion, the more you study magic, the more you realize no one has all the answers. We are, what's that word from the poem, right? Ignorant armies clashing by night, right? We are as on a darkling plain, confused by alarms of struggle and flight, ignorant armies clash by night, you know, Dover Beach. So, yeah, I definitely don't think anyone should be saying Dunn does it this way. You know, I am an authority. I have a PhD, but it's not in this. So I don't put that. That's why my PhD is not on the cover of these books. That would be a foolish thing to do.
Yeah.
It's honest.
But having a PhD is a guarantee of having research skills. So even though it's not specifically your field, you're not someone who's going to just scratch the surface. You're someone who's going to immerse yourself in it.
That's why it is handy to have a college education. It's, you do get some skills that are transferable.
Absolutely.
You also developed a tremendous tolerance for boredom, which if you're going to learn ancient Greek, you will need. Although actually I loved learning ancient Greek. I remember turning the page of my grammar and discovering I had only begun verbs. I thought I had them. And then I'm like, oh, no. Now you have to learn this whole other class of verbs. And I actually was laughing out loud. And I said to no one because I was alone, but I said, is this a practical joke? Did they just invent this language and mess with me? But it's a wonderful language. So, yeah.
In your text, you equate the holy guardian angel, Agathos daemon, and the genius. How do you see the function of this entity in the pursuit of henosis or union with the divine?
That's a difficult question because I'm still wrestling with it a little bit, what I think that is. There's references to in the Greek magical papyri, right? There's references to the Paredros, the one who walks beside, as sort of a tutelary god that is with you. We have an account of Proclus undergoing a theurgic ritual to discover, was Proclus? One of the theurgists, to discover who his tutelary god was, and discovering that it was actually or tutelary spirit was, and discovering it was actually a god, which was apparently a big deal. And then of course there's Socrates, who speaks about his daimonion, the divine thing in his mind that helps guide him. So there's this thread running through that, like, we're not in it alone, that there's help. Crowley, of course, sort of takes that and systematizes it. Crowley was a great systematizer. He loved systems, but of course he did. He was a Victorian British man. So he got to put things in boxes, please. And so he systematized it as this sort of gateway to the Holy Guardian Angel, which he gets from the Abramelin the Mage. I think his system is great for people it works for, but I don't think that's exactly the same thing as they're talking about in antiquity. But I'm not exactly sure 100% what they were getting at in antiquity. And I'm not 100% sure that the daimonion, the Paredros, and these other things are actually the same thing.
Well, the impression that I got as I was reading your book was that you were equating the guardian angel, Agathos daemon, and the genius. However, you saw the Paredros as something separate. You saw it as a magical assistant, and you referred to the witch trials of the 15th to the 18th centuries, where they were referred to as familiar spirits or familiars. And that idea also occurs in the Bible, right, where you had the apostles going into towns, and they would find mediums or wonder workers, and they would cut their tie with their familiar spirit, and they'd be left powerless.
Well, the Witch of Endor.
Well, that was a necromancy,
right? But she's described as having a familiar spirit. Yeah.
So the idea that the Bible tries to convey is that a medium has no power of their own. Every bit of power that they have comes from the Paredros. But now I get the impression from that you're seeing the Paredros as something that you have alongside of you, that then gives you access to your HGA or Agathos daemon or genius.
Maybe, yeah. And I think, I might have given the impression that I have a stronger opinion about how those things exist than I necessarily do. Like I said, I'm still kind of working it out. Paredros literally means beside the road or along the road, right? So it's the one who walks beside you on the road, which I really like. And the familiar, one interpretation, I guess the interpretation that some biblical scholars would take with that is that you only have power through the familiar. But familiars exist in lots of cultures in interesting ways, or something we might call a familiar exists in lots of cultures in interesting ways. And it becomes really complicated. I think it was B.J. Swain just wrote a recent book on familiars, Familiar Unto Me, and he goes into some depth about the tradition of familiars. And I'm just finishing reading that right now, and that's kind of changing some of my perceptions of things.
My impression of the Paradros is that it's an entity that's able to accomplish things on your behalf. However, when you look at the HGA from that you gain access to through Abramelin, it's an angelic entity that has power over demons. So it's the demons that are actually doing things for you, and your HGA is directing them. So they do seem to be different in that respect.
That's a really good point. I mean, the Abramelin guardian angel is different, because really the purpose of achieving knowledge and conversation of that guardian angel is to subject the demons to your authority.
Yeah.
If you try to go in the wrong order, supposedly bad things happen, right? Like if you try to use the magic squares without having gotten your authority from the HGA, then you're in trouble. So that's a really good point. I mean, that's something to think about, certainly. And then how that fits into the idea of the agathos daimon, from a Hellenic perspective, which is also complicated by the fact that that phrase refers to several different things. If you've read in the Orphic hymns, right, the hymn to the agathos daimon is a hymn to Zeus specifically. But then in Roman religion, there's the belief that everyone has a genius, an individual being that is sometimes called their personal Jupiter, right? That you get your own personal Jupiter, which isn't that a punk song, I think?
Well, no, there's a personal Jesus. I don't know about a personal Jupiter. That was Depeche Mode and Marilyn Manson.
Hey.
But the agathos daimon was popularly portrayed as a snake. And even though the Greek gods tended to be portrayed as human looking, there was actually one version of a chthonic Zeus that had a snake form. So perhaps there's a tie in that way.
And that would make a certain amount of sense, I suppose, thematically, because one of the roles of the agathos daimon in a home is to tie you to your ancestral gods, and which would be, chthonic ancestral connections. So yeah, that's interesting. See, I need to do a lot of thinking about this still. That's why I say I'm not an authority, because there's still things where I'm hashing it out for myself and I'm not sure I'm right.
Well, Crowley spent his whole life wrestling, trying to work out the nature of his HGA, Aiwas. He couldn't work out whether it was an angelic entity assigned to him at birth or whether it was his higher self, which is a concept that came into vogue through psychology. So I don't think he ever decided what it was.
No, and his writings are inconsistent. In Magic Without Tears, he says it's one thing. In book 4, he says it's another thing, and you just catch him on a particular day, apparently, and has an opinion about what Aiwas was.
So in the book, you actually present a short ritual for making contact with the Holy Guardian Angel, agathos daimon or genius, which is adapted from the Greek magical papyri. And you also mentioned the Abramelin operation, and you mentioned Crowley's Liber Samech. Do you feel that one of those is superior, or is it just a matter of readers finding what best resonates with them?
I know people who have claimed knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel who have used all those methods. So, I know someone who did I know several people who've done the entire Abramelin working. I have not done the whole thing. But I know people who have followed the whole thing. I know someone who did Liber Samech like 3 times and suddenly received knowledge and conversation, just like that. He was pretty well primed for it, though. So I think there's multiple ways there. Wherever there is, right? Whatever you end up with when you get there. Yeah. Whether it's a different entity, whether it's your higher self, whether it's a tutelary deity.
And I also like the way you pointed out the importance of finding the name of your HGA. I mean, that's something that holds true in demonic workings and everything else. You need to have the name of an entity in order to have power over it.
Yeah, well, names are extremely important in many cultures when it comes to magic, certainly. Yeah.
Yeah, especially in spirit realms, because many spirits have the power of shape-shifting. So their appearance is variable, but once you have their true name, that's the one constant, the one thing that they can't change. So the impression that I got from your book was that you were saying that the paredidos was useful for thaumaturgy, which you refer to as practical magic, whereas the HGA or agathos daemonogenius is better suited for theurgy. In the past, there have been lengthy discussions as to the difference between thaumaturgy and theurgy. How do you see the difference between them?
Well, thaumaturgy is make my crops grow. Theurgy is connect me to the underlying ground of being, right? And like I said earlier in the interview, I said, you know, you still need to eat to do theurgy. So I think they both have a role. I mean, I do both, right? I do practical magic. I do theurgy. And I also I think I say at one point that theurgy for me is like the battery of practical magic. It's like a power source for it. Once you have some sort of divine authority, once you have some sort of connection to the underlying ground of being, it becomes a lot easier to get things to go your way through thaumaturgy.
I remember reading a few years ago that there were a number of people who wanted to not be referred to as magicians, and they would refer to themselves as thaumaturgists instead. It's almost like calling yourself a thaumaturgist in late antiquity seemed to be a title that was socially acceptable, whereas being a magician was not.
That's interesting. I mean, what, you know, you might be called a goes, which would be a very socially unacceptable name. That would imply necromancy.
Yeah.
Amagos would imply sort of foreign and strange because it's a borrowing from Persian. Whereas thaumaturgy is at least built out of good Greek roots, right?
Yes.
Working. So yeah, that's interesting. I wonder if there's, see, now I'm wondering if there's any apocryphal works where Jesus is described as a thaumaturge. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, Simon certainly is, Simon the Magus, but he's described as a magus, specifically Simon the Magus. So I don't know. That would take some reading to think about, I think. But
well, the earliest representations of Jesus actually had him holding a wand. There was one painting in a crypt where he was resurrecting Lazarus out of a tomb, and he's standing there with a magic wand. So it seems like a lot of the early Christians considered him to be a practicing magician. And if you look at the writings of Morton Smith, who's one of my heroes, you look at what's the book called? Jesus Christ the Magician or something like that. He convincingly states that Jesus Christ fits the mold of a Hellenistic magician. And that's basically how I tend to see him.
Yeah, that's interesting. You know, I'm not a Christian, so I feel less qualified to weigh in on Christian figures, but I think culturally, I imagine there would have been plenty of people who would have seen anyone running around performing miracles as, I mean, what else would you call them but a miracle worker, right? A thaumaturge.
So. Exactly. I mean, there were so many wonder workers or magicians at the time. You mentioned Simon Magus, but apart from him, there was Apollonius of Tyana, who lived at the same time as Jesus, performed many of the same sorts of signs. And interestingly, we know exactly what he looked like. We have his representation on statues and on coins, whereas no one actually knows what Jesus looked like. So you could argue that there's more evidence for Apollonius of Tyana existing than that of Jesus Christ. There was Honi the Circle Maker. There were a number of magicians who were doing many of the same sort of things that Jesus was doing, but the only one who's come down to us is Jesus. they say history is written by the victors.
Well, he got very good PR,
Yes.
well, and also the right kairos, right? The right moment in time for that particular brand of faith to take off. And I don't cast any aspersions against Christianity. I don't like people who do, frankly. I don't think that's productive, to rip on other people's religions. But I think, from a historical perspective, good PR, a message that people needed to hear, and the right moment in history. And here we are. So
Yeah, I'm totally with you on that. I think that everyone should have the right to choose the belief system which resonates with them, and they should be able to follow that system without persecution from anyone.
right. And that doesn't mean people are above criticism or faith is above criticism, but it means that there's no point in just disliking an entire religion. I think that's short-sighted, but I mean, no, yeah, we're not doing that. We're just talking about
No. And at the end of the day, there's good people in every religion. There's good people and bad people in every religion. And it's so easy to cherry pick people and say, oh, there's all these nasty people and they're all Christians. Well, there are a whole lot of Christians who are really good people.
and
People
more than a few really nasty pagans. So
yeah. Exactly. Okay, so it seems to me that regardless of your spiritual path, the incorporation of theurgic elements would be of great benefit. Do you think there are any paths which would benefit more than others?
No, I mean, I think there are theurgic elements pretty much in every faith already. A lot of Neoplatonic methods have entered into Christianity. There's wonderful forms of esoteric Islam, such as Sufism, that are just beautiful. There's obviously, we've talked about the Kabbalah already. So these things, I think people have a hunger for a practical technique to get there, and so anyone with that hunger can benefit from theurgic techniques, whether or not they're connected to paganism.
So to sum up, how has your life and the life of others improved by working with the Orphic hymns and theurgy? This is when you get to sell your stuff.
Yes. Well, I now own a yacht. No, I don't. I wouldn't want a yacht. I don't think. I wouldn't know what to do with it. I alluded to this earlier when I said that. I mean, I guess this probably doesn't sell in very well, but I'm a kinder, more understanding person. At least partially because of theurgy, partially because of meditation and devotion. And I'm more understanding with myself and my foibles, my weaknesses. I recognize that I don't always live up to what I want, and then I try to do better. I try to develop virtue. I try to strengthen my virtues. So, as far as selling myself, I don't know that people will shell out a lot of money for you can become more virtuous, but they probably should, right? As far as magic goes, theurgy has informed my thaumaturgy, and my thaumaturgy has shaped my life. I have achieved many of the goals that I set out to do in my life, and now I have new, more interesting goals to pursue. So it can't solve every problem. Everyone has things to struggle with and problems to solve, that they may not be their own doing. We've all got health. We're all going to get sick. We're all going to die. If the pandemic showed us anything, it's that mental health is something we all need to really be aware of, and can lose our grips on, right? Certainly about the first year of teaching over Zoom, I was talking to a therapist and I think everyone was, right? So, or probably should have been. But it's the thaumaturgy and theurgy that gives you the strength and the awareness of yourself to do that, to look at your mind and go, okay, I need there's a problem here right now, and I need to solve it, and have the courage to do that. So I don't know if that's a good answer. Certainly not a good sales pitch, but that's the truth, unfortunately.
No, I think it's an excellent answer. The thing is, you can't always change circumstances around you, but you can change your response to those circumstances. So you can be less perturbed by things. And if the shutdown taught us anything, it taught us how important human interaction was. You know, suicide rates went through the roof, drug use, alcohol use went through the roof because people were living in isolation. And most people can't live in isolation. We need to have social interaction. And even though this is nice, it will be much nicer if we're sitting in the same room by a fireside having a chat.
Well, yeah, one of the things I learned is I am perfectly content to sit in my house with a book for a week, but not for a year, right?
Yeah.
So, but I mean, that was a situation where we were between a Scylla and a Charybdis, and we had to weave our way between it. So, yeah, I don't know. I probably would have given a different answer before the pandemic, right? But like you said, we can't control our circumstances. One thing we can do is influence our circumstances, and magic helped me at least influence my circumstances during the pandemic. Me and mine got through it without huge disasters. Not everyone was so fortunate, but yeah. So
what current projects are you engaging in? I know you're incredibly busy. I tried to do this interview last weekend. You're at a conference. So what projects do you have?
Okay, so I'm actually working on a couple things. I'm working on a collaboration. I don't want to say a whole bunch about it, but it's going to involve geomancy. I'll say that.
Wow.
And that has slowed down a little bit over the summer because I got busy with other things. But that is a thing that I want to come back to. I'm working with a brilliant geomancer, but that's all I'll say about that right now. The other thing I'm working on is a class on, well, probably part of a series of classes on basic magic. So I'm working on a course on basic sigil magic that I'm hoping to be able to release hopefully within a month or two. So that's
very cool.
I'm working on. And then probably that will start, depending on its popularity, that will start some other courses. One of the great things that came out of the pandemic for me, not many great things, but one of the great things is I learned a lot about video editing. I learned a lot about audio editing. Having lectures, but via podcast taught me a lot. And so now I have those skills that I can start to put toward delivery of some ideas outside of a book form.
So how can people learn more about you, or perhaps even contact you? Is there a website or some sort of resource that people can access?
The best way is to get a lead tablet and a stylus. No,
and nail it down at the hippodrome.
Exactly. I had a blog that has gone defunct because I just stopped doing it. I intend to put together a larger web presence soon for those classes. Right now, it's not up and running yet. So probably the best way to reach me is I do have an author's Facebook page that one can follow. And of course, I have email, which I think is readily available everywhere. So pwdunn@gmail.com. I don't have a Twitter, and I probably won't get one now that it's been taken over by Elon. I don't see much value in it at this point. But like I said, I am working on a website soonish. But probably the best ways to get a hold of me are via email or through my Facebook author's webpage.
Cool. Susan, are you out there somewhere?
I am right here, lovingly watching you guys and really enjoying this great interview. I'm here.
Okay, because we've just about come to the end. I've covered a hell of a lot of ground with Patrick. Do you have any questions for him or any observations, anything you'd like to add before we bring it to a close?
I cannot wait to rush out there and get Divine Magic. I am going to be adding that to my collection, and I certainly hope that this book comes highly recommended. In addition, pick up Orphic hymns, everybody. These are fabulous, fabulous additions to anybody's bookshelf. And thank you so much, Patrick, for coming on and spending part of your day with us and just telling us, from your heart place, like what we all know going through COVID, and just kind of like connecting to the simple things in life. It's a personal experience, but it's been beautiful and wonderful getting to know you. So thanks for coming on.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate your inviting me, and I'm glad we were able to finally make it work.
Finally, yeah. Patrick, thank you so much for coming on the show and letting us get to know you a little bit better. I and Susan as well wish you success with all your future endeavors. Have a great evening.
Thank you so much. Thanks again for coming on. Bye-bye, guys. See you around.
Bye.